Aloha, everyone, and welcome to the 43rd Annual Hawaii International Film Festival presented by Holly Kawani, and today's discussion with the filmmakers from Join or Die as part of our Film for Thought series in partnership with the Hawaii Council for the Humanities. This series is designed to combine thought-provoking film with scholar-led discussions and writing. So we are very, very excited that we have today together with us the directors of Join or Die, Rebecca Davis and Pete Davis. And our conversation today will be moderated by scholar Halena Kapuni-Reynolds, who is the Associate Curator of Native Hawaiian History and Culture at the National Museum of the American Indian. Halena Kapuni-Reynolds was born in Hilo, raised in the Hawaiian homeland community of Keaukaha and the rainforest of Ola'a'a on Hawaii Island. Over the years, Halena has volunteered to serve on the advisory and executive boards of various Hawaiian and Hawaii-based organizations, including the Pi'ilani Hawaiian Civic Club of Colorado, the Keaukaha Community Association, the Hawaii Museums Association, and the East Hawaii Cultural Center. So we are very excited to have Halena moderating today's conversation. Before we get started, I just want to again extend a special mahalo to Hawaii Council for the Humanities, without which this program would not be possible. And to remind those that if you are watching this conversation ahead of our upcoming festival, which starts this Thursday at Ward and Kahala Theaters, we do have 2 screenings of Join or Die coming up, and I'll pop back at the end of the conversation for more information about those and other Film for Thought discussions in this year's Film for Thought program. Before we get started today, I want to introduce Liz Soto from the Hawaii Council for the Humanities to talk a little bit more about this year's theme for the program and also about the Hawaii Council for the Humanities. So welcome, Liz.
Mahalo, Anna. Aloha mai kako. I'm Liz Soto, as Anna said, Director of Literary and Conversation Programming at the Hawaii Council for Humanities, where our mission is to connect people with ideas that enrich lives, broaden perspectives, and strengthen communities. Our Film for Thought collaboration with Hawaii International Film Festival is always a highlight of our programming year. So mahalo to everyone at HIFF for being our partner in this endeavor for more than 10 years. United We Stand, our theme for the 2023 Film for Thought series, is a phrase so often heard in the United States. The second half of the saying, "Divided we fall," is frequently left unsaid. It is assumed that it's already known, but what remains unknown? And what might we not be asking when we hear United We Stand? In a society that places a particular emphasis on the freedoms of the individual, what does it mean to stand united? This theme is also supported by National Endowment for Humanities United We Stand Connecting Through Cultural Funding for its national network of state and jurisdictional humanities councils supporting local programming that helps communities counter the destructive effects of hate-fueled violence on our democracy and public safety. The essays written by our Film for Thought scholars ask us to deepen our understanding of these films and further push us to consider what it means to be united, particularly when significant parts of our societies have been and continue to be systematically disenfranchised from dominating culture and narrative. So we ask the questions: why are we united? What are we standing for? Who is standing with us? Who is standing for us? Mahalo ho to HIFF, to the directors of these beautiful, thoughtful films, and to our humanities scholars for offering us more ways to think about how we view the world.
Thank you, Liz, for that introduction. And hello, Rebecca and Pete. How are you today?
Hello, glad to be here. And what a beautiful theme for this year. We're really honored to be included in this programming.
Absolutely. This film definitely falls within that theme, and I'm looking forward to the conversation we're going to be having. As you folks have already noted, I come from a civic organizing background. So when I watched this documentary, it made me really excited that you folks are trying to cultivate this conversation on why it's important to join clubs and to support community in that way. So to begin, would you folks introduce yourselves and perhaps share a little bit of your early civic engagement and organizing experiences?
Sure. So I'm Rebecca Davis. We are a brother-sister filmmaking team. And Pete and I actually grew up in a very civic town in Falls Church, Virginia. It was a community outside of Washington, D.C., and it had a lot of people from all over, people who didn't necessarily have like deep roots going back a long way, but who kind of were bringing a lot of different cultural perspectives to the town. And so I think, naturally, given that we were, really drawn to Bob's work as we approached him to do this documentary.
Yeah, and I'm Pete Davis, and we had this, just to double down on what my sister said, it was a town where everyone came out for the Memorial Day parade to celebrate all the clubs that had, floats or so in the parade. It was a town where every kid was encouraged to be part of different things. And it was a town that had a weekly newspaper. And that's a really important institution in local community life, where you would care just as much about what was going on locally as you would care about going on nationally because of that local media. Mm-hmm. And so this was all kind of added up to us having an interest in this. And, as we grew up, we noticed, it's not always that civic of a story everywhere, and we might be the exception in Falls Church. And when we found Bob's work talking about, one, it really resonated about the importance of civics to a well-functioning society, but also it resonated about the decline of civics over the last 50 years and how that's affecting our country. So, and we've seen that as we've kind of come of age.
Wonderful. When I think of one of my early experiences in civics, it takes me back to being a child at a Hawaiian language immersion program where I'm from in Keaukaha, and I would be there late in the evening because my mother worked for the school. And so I would attend the Girl Scout meetings they had at the cafeteria because they were friends and they were really welcoming. But it was my first experience really just learning more about these organizations and the work that they do for our communities. So, you mentioned that this film was really an opportunity to showcase some of Bob's work. But how did you arrive at the conclusion that a documentary on the decline of civic engagement in the U.S. was necessary at this point in time? Was there more to this than simply Bob's scholarship?
Yeah, and I guess I should say, we started this film in 2017. Having a film about community and our issues about community makes a lot of sense right now coming out in 2023. We've all just lived through these difficult years with the pandemic, community's front of mind. But when we approached Bob in 2017, obviously there was a sense that things were kind of off, but not quite to the level that, we're feeling now. But for me, it was really kind of a personal story in approaching Bob. I had been working in the national media. I was a news producer at NBC News for many years, for like almost a decade before we started working on this film. And I was going around, flying, all over the country and covering a lot of the symptoms of Bob's work on the ground. Things like, the opioid epidemic, teen suicide, school shootings, and, just a general sense that there'd been kind of a loss in solidarity, across the country and among our neighbors and in our communities. So I felt like I was seeing a lot of the symptoms of Bob's work, and, really wanting a chance to revisit, this work in film and this work that I knew from Pete, who I guess we should say was a student of Bob Putnam. So that was kind of our personal connection. Pete, do you want to talk a little bit about being involved?
Yeah, when I took Bob's class, I took it around 2010. It was, for people my age, a lot of millennials, it was one of the most hopeful times in our generation. People thought that all of the answers to our public problems, many people thought all the answers to our public problems were right on the horizon. The internet is going to solve everything. The latest app is going to solve everything. The latest march in the streets is going to solve everything. The latest politician is going to solve everything. Everyone thought the silver bullet that was going to solve public problems was just around the corner. And so when we're talking about in Bob's class, it really resonated with me, but it wasn't fully landed yet when he said, actually, I'm going to do some counter programming for all of you young people and say, we've actually are on the tail end of a large decline in civic engagement. And all of my research shows that that's going to cause a lot of problems for American democracy sooner or later. It might already be happening and suddenly everyone's going to wake up to it. And over the course of the 13 years since I took that class, everyone has started to wake up to it. I think a lot of people saw it early, but now people have come around and said, we really have an isolation crisis here. We really have a loneliness crisis. We really have a polarization crisis. We really have an inequality crisis. We really have a division crisis. And all of Bob's kind of predictions have come true. And also, were all of those silver bullets turned out to not be the solution to our public problems. And one of the reasons we wanted to revisit Bob's story is not only that he was prescient about the problems, it's that his answer was not the quick and easy answer. His answer was the long and hard answer, which actually might go deep enough to actually make a dent on these problems, which is the only thing that's going to change things is if we do the day in, day out, year in, year out work of slowly weaving our country together, one relationship, one club, one reform project at a time, often in your local area, not just kind of about national things. And over time, that will grow up and ripple out. And that's the only answer that's given me hope right now. And we wanted to kind of get that message across with the movie.
That message definitely comes across. And as a fellow millennial, I definitely know what you mean about the early 2010s and even the early 2000s to some extent. Yes, there was the kind of recession and the things happening. But as a young person, it really felt like there was so much organizing happening in community. And now stepping into more of a leadership role in these entities, really seeing the difficulty we're having with just meeting or getting things done in a way that is conducive and efficient. Whereas I think today there are so many perhaps barriers, challenges to even getting everybody on the same page, that it's part of this larger conversation that this documentary really begins.
Totally. That is something we wanted to get across with the movie. There's two sides to this that we see. One is I could call civic memory. The other is civic muscle. So let me talk about civic memory first. And I'd love my sister, who's great, talking about civic muscle. Civic memory is that we really wanted to show in this movie is that we have forgotten that this third part of our life, not just our home life, and family life, not just our work life, the grind, but this third part of our life, our civic and community life, used to be an equal leg of the stool. It used to be, I found an old letter from my grandpa, and he was not an abnormal person. He was a very ordinary, I love him, but very, usual, normal American at the time. And it said, I go to 3 meetings a week. Like that was a normal part of everyday life. You would put your civic affiliation, some people would put them on their headstones. You would make friends at these civic clubs. You would see politics not as watching TV and posting, but see it as actually going to meetings and being part of reform efforts or electoral efforts. This memory of this part of American life is not only for when Bob first came out with Bowling Alone, people said, oh, I remember that from my childhood. So it was kind of a nostalgia book. For our generation, it's a totally lost memory. We don't even remember it from our childhood. It's just wisps of stories from our grandparents' generation. And one of our goals is to bring back that memory of all of the things that we love today, all of the victories that were won civically, were because people decided to put in the work to meet. And I also think we should talk about civic muscle. So like, what does it mean that our civic muscles have atrophied? And I'll throw that over to my sister to talk about.
Yeah, I mean, and I think these are skills that we aren't born with, and we need to be cultivating them, in our education system, in our communities, in our families. And so we often think about, this idea of we need to be going to the gym and working our civic muscles the same way we're, maybe going to our yoga class or whatever, because you aren't born knowing how to run a meeting. It's a skill, and it's a skill to put yourself out there too, and get on the phone or send a bunch of emails out and say, hey, this Thursday night, instead of going home and sitting on your cell phone or watching Netflix, I think we should all go to this place and talk about this thing that we all care about. And doing that for the first time, for a lot of people in our generation feels new. And I think over the course of doing this film, we tended to meet people in one category or the other. And there's really been this fallout in the middle. where we would either meet people that, I'd say, oh, we're going to film about clubs and membership. Are you a member of anything? And if they were a member of one thing, they were usually a member of 10 other things, because they knew how to work those muscles. And then they also knew how much it brought to their life. And being part of one group tends to have this snowball effect, where then you meet other people. I see you nodding your head. I imagine you're in this category. Or I would meet other people and they'd be like, oh, clubs, huh? Yeah, what do you mean? Like, oh yeah, I was a member of the Girl Scouts or whatever when I was younger. I was in a fraternity in college maybe, but yeah, these days not really. And what we, want to express in this movie is we need to plump up that middle section, and get everyone kind of practicing and in this practice again. And it is work. It's not easy.
Absolutely. It's really important to recognize it as work. And as I was watching the film, I was trying to think about those kind of nuts and bolts things of how to help people, or what are the skill sets we need today in the 21st century to help people incorporate this work back into their lives in a world where we're so busy all the time, not just for our own personal reasons, and just trying to make sense of government and business, or just how to do things anew, especially after this pandemic. So many of these comments do resonate with me as well. And, coming from a Hawaiian homelands community, civic organizing is definitely something that I grew up with, because we had to speak back to government in so many different ways because of the ways that we weren't being heard. And having been in that space for so long, I'm on the heels of my parents and my great-grandparents in particular. I do have I think it's a cash notebook, but that my great-grandmother used to keep tabs when she was the secretary of our Farmers Association, which she then later used to post over recipes. But, those documents and those archives, and making time to talk about them again and to honor the work of those who are our predecessors, to hear about the memory of this work, is so important to get that buy-in. But also to help folks know that, there are these challenges with civic organizing, but we have solutions, and we have folks who have been figuring it out along the way. It's just getting back to having conversations with one another again, and learning how to communicate that in ways that are productive.
Totally. And I think we use this idea of clubs very, broadly. And some people could see that on the surface as oh, this is just, my hobbies or whatever. But, our ultimate subversive message we're trying to get through is exactly what you're talking to, which is groups are power. And we're going to get where we need to get to a lot faster together than we are alone. And that starts by meeting up, whether it's meeting up at the bowling alley or meeting up for direct political action. That's where that work begins.
Yeah, we were really happy to be able to show in the film the two sides of social networks. So, the most common question we get is, aren't there bad clubs? And we are totally, Bob and we are totally upfront about that. The Ku Klux Klan was a club. The history of American oppression was organized through social networks of powerful people coming together to exclude other people. But we really wanted it to not just be a story of kind of oppressor and victimhood. We wanted to tell the civic story of overcoming and of resisting and of fighting too. And we were so glad, Eddie Glaude has this beautiful riff while we were interviewing him, and we were so happy to be able to put it in the movie. The great Princeton religion scholar, Eddie Glaude, he said, for example, one group in America that, has a tremendous overcoming story of struggle, the Black community in America, before they were legally allowed to vote for president, they had presidents of their local, church, or they had presidents of their local, abolitionist group or NAACP. And he talks about how civic spaces were not only a place that built power, they themselves were a place where you could prefigure being in power and learn those leadership skills, so that by the time that you broke through and were able to take formal power, you were ready. And we were so happy to kind of show those flip sides of the coin in the film, that social networks can be used for ill, and they can also be used to fight them. And it's such an important story. And for those who kind of had the privilege that social networks were hobbies, for every one of those, there's another where social networks and civic organizations were a necessity to survive and overcome. And I'm so glad you raised that.
I'm also glad you folks brought up that, civics isn't always necessarily having to mean doing the hard things, right? Or always focusing on struggle, but that it can also just mean coming together as like-minded individuals and forming a club or a group where those seeds can be planted for change in the future. Because, we might start meeting with somebody just because of a hobby, but that doesn't mean that can't lead to something else as the community continues to develop and as more people become involved in it. And this is actually a great segue to our third question, because you did mention this wonderful quote from one of your interviewees. And so I did want to ask, what was it like organizing these interviews with these really decorated leaders in the United States? And were there any other gems from those interviews that didn't make the cut for the documentary? Because as directors, I'm sure you're familiar with, there's so much that could have been in, but because of timing, you have to kind of be strategic in what you're selecting.
Yeah. I mean, that was probably, many hours banging our heads on the table, and not just all the amazing interviewees that we were able to surround Bob by, but even condensing Bob's work down. I think Pete and I started with 100 graphs that we thought we'd get into the film, and then, realized we had to cut those down to like 10 maybe that we could possibly fit in. The film ends up being kind of like a 101 intro course to these ideas of social capital and their connections to community and democracy. But yeah, I mean, we were lucky enough that, we didn't want to make the film just a hagiography about an academic's life and work. We wanted to bring around, a bunch of people to contextualize him, to bring some of his ideas, into our current conversation that's happening. His famous book, Bowling Alone, that the movie spent a lot of time on, came out in 2000, but this film is coming out in 2023. And yeah, I mean, I think, hours of footage. Every interviewee could have been their own documentary in themselves. And, with our community groups, I will say also, we were able to highlight 6 community groups, and each of those could also be, an hour-and-a-half documentary just on the groups themselves. But I think our hope is that, there's a little bit of something for everyone that's interested in kind of these ideas, whether it's the economic angle, the education angle, the community organizing angle, that they'll take some idea away from this film, but use it as a spark to get out and, read more, read the books of, the many books that all of the scholars in our films have written, or read more of their ideas.
Pete, is there anything that you wanted to add? Any gems you can think off the top of your head on these interviews?
Yeah, my favorite, we loved all the interviewees, but I really liked 3 of the interviewees that got really into the brass tacks of organizing, and they came at it from different angles. So you have Priya Parker in our film, who talks about the art of gathering, and she gets into the specifics of, everyone, our whole goal was to move people to action. And the thing you need in action is not just kind of the idealism and the motivation. You need tactics. And she gets into, you have to decide where the space is that you're meeting, and the space sets the tone of your meeting. You have to decide to have an invitation and make the invitation fun, because the invitation is the beginning of your gathering. And she talks about that. We had Jane McAlevey, the great union organizer, and she had all this stuff we had to leave on the cutting room floor of, you got to hold good meetings. If you hold a bad meeting, everyone's going to want to quit your union effort. You got to learn the art and craft of holding a good meeting. Keep everyone on topic. Don't let anyone derail it. make sure everyone's heard. And then we had the great political scientist and kind of civic theorist Hari Hahn from Johns Hopkins, who talked, wax poetic about the difference between mobilizing and organizing. Mobilizing is taking a group of people on your email list, getting them riled up to, vote or send one letter or go to one march. Organizing is having those long one-to-one conversations, developing leaders from those one-to-one conversations, bringing people together, having good structure where you break people off into working groups and have different schedules of meetings, where the working groups meet and the whole group meets, and they have different purposes. And if you hone that craft and do all that work, you can do a lot more than just riling people up to vote once or write one letter or go to one march. You can sustain a a Montgomery bus boycott for a whole year. You can do the 5 years of struggle it might take to get a reform off the ground. You can do multiple election cycles to really hold people accountable and hold them accountable after you get them in to pass the things you voted them in for. All of those details of the concrete aspects, we'd love a second movie that's just tips and tricks of how to join.
Absolutely. If this is the 101 film, you definitely need to make the 202 film and the 303, because there's so many aspects of civic organizing that this film just touches on, but would help so many folks to name and to just think about, how can we do this into the future? How can we use it with the technologies that we have today that help kind of streamline some of the things that may have been taking longer in the past? I believe, Rebecca, you brought up some of the organizations you folks have worked with as part of the interviewees. So I thought if you folks had any kind of comments on what it was like kind of reaching out to these organizations, I'm sure that they must have wondered, wow, what's this film going to be about when you folks contacted them?
Yeah, and I will say, even just selecting 6 organizations, the challenge of, we wanted to show a wide variety of the ways Americans get together in this country. And we wanted people watching to at least see some part of themselves maybe in one of these groups. Inevitably, we fell short of that because that's just incredibly hard to do. But we really wanted to find a diversity of ways that people were getting together and around a diversity of different causes. And I think the real challenge of pinning down those groups was we also wanted groups that weren't explicitly partisan. And in this moment that we're living in, which Bob's data also bears out of just extreme polarization, a lot of the ways people are getting together right now are around issues that are very polarizing. And so one kind of limiting factor we tried to use as we were thinking okay, out of the millions of groups in the country, which direction do we go in? We had spreadsheets of hundreds of groups. We really wanted groups that were rooted in place, so that the work they were doing was deeply rooted in the community that they lived in the people that were close by to them, and the issues that were close to home. Because that's where we feel as we start to move out of this moment of deep polarization, that we're really going to see forward motion when we aren't just, MSNBC or Fox News, what's happening in Washington and what team do we join, but these issues in our towns that don't necessarily fall on these kind of red-blue lines. So that kind of helped us as we were trying to narrow down the groups. And then, I think also a really wonderful thing about getting work on this project was to be able to lift up groups that were part of the solution. Because I think, there's too much right now in a lot of the national news that we get on the day-to-day that's focused on this is wrong, this is wrong, this is wrong. And I think one thing that our local news did such a good job, and that we lose as our local news has really been struggling in recent decades, is stories of celebration that people can watch and think, oh, that person did that thing. That doesn't seem so far out of reach. I have this other idea. If they could start that, maybe I could start my thing. So we also wanted groups that felt like they were doing big things, but things that weren't so far out of the question that it couldn't be something the average person, could get off the ground with, getting a few friends together.
And this gets down to we had a few rules for ourselves with this film, is because it's such a big thing to wrap your arms around. So we had to kind of set our ground rules and spirits in which we wanted to do this. And one of our spirits was, we didn't want to tell a story of doomsday, 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 and then in the final minute say, write your congressman about this issue or something. We wanted to flip the script because it really could have gone that way. This is a really sad story. It's about American loneliness and isolation and decline. We wanted to flip it on its head and say, let's actually not tell that story, will be part of it, but let's have the main story be the story about the flip side of that, which is, what does it look like when we are fighting that? And what that is American community life. So we wanted the opening line of the movie to be, opening line of narration to be, this is a film about why you should join a club and why the fate of America may depend on it. And then we wanted the movie to unspool what we meant by that, so that right from the beginning, right from the first word of our title, join or die, join is an action verb. And like, I think what everyone's really hungry for is, I don't think people want to read more necessarily. I don't think they want to post more. I don't think they want to affirm that they're on the right side more. I think people really want to get towards action. And we tried to draw out that in American history, usually the first action word that gets the ball rolling in the right direction on things is the word join. And so we were so loved these examples that my sister talks about of people who are just starting right now, bring it together. And so many of them, and we tried to get these clips in the movie, so many of them said, these lines kept coming up. I really wanted this for myself, so I started it. Or I felt like there wasn't something in our city for this, so I started it. I didn't ask permission, so I started it. And we want people to have that spirit too, because it's not just join, it's also create the things that people can join. So.
And I will say, I think a lot of those lines come from Zara in our film, who started Red Biking and Green, a cycling group in Atlanta. And she's originally from Hawaii. So I imagine a lot of that civic spirit from her comes from coming from an incredibly civic state and now bringing that to her new community in Atlanta.
I love that you folks have really brought up some of the things we're dealing with today, such as kind of the doom and gloom that we see often within national media, as well as this challenge with local news, getting back to reporting and really highlighting not just the challenges and the struggles we're facing, but the incredible work that's taking place. Those are comments that resonate with me as somebody who oftentimes tries to work in an in-between space, really trying not to pick sides, when really I'm here for my community. I'm trying to do as best as I can without trying to I guess, choose politics in a way that leads to divisiveness. Because, well, millennial generation, now in our kind of maturity as fully grown and conscious adults, really just seeing how that decline has happened over the years, and how we're creating groups, but we're creating groups that are somewhat similar, but we don't necessarily mesh. So there's like 5 different groups sometimes, and then you feel like you have to choose one or the other, when really you just want to be there for your friends and community. So there's definitely a need to be able to not just only have space for those really critical moments and critical civic organizings, but also for fun, for ways for us to just come together and to nourish each other in those community spaces. So as it's another great transition for our next kind of question that I wanted to pose for you folks is, given our current political moment, and in your folks' opinion, what are some of the challenges that we see in civic organizing today? And how can we make civic organizing a more sustained endeavor as we think and move towards the future?
Yeah, I think there's, I think I'll point to one big one, which is, and this is from one of our great interviewees, Hari Han. She says, we cannot mistake attention for power. And I think that's a huge issue today, where our phones and the company, and, I would say in a power analysis of our phones, the companies that run the apps and fully own the apps that kind of addict us on our phones, they want you to think that attention automatically equals power. And attention, raising awareness and attention is an important part of civics. That's part of it. But usually you need to convert that attention into organizing that eventually converts into power. And so you need to take that, everyone's paying attention and hearing that something's wrong. You need to convert that into a sign-up sheet where people sign up to come to the Thursday meetings. And then you are diligent in those Thursday meetings and well-organized and hone your civic craft of keeping it fun and keeping it on track and things like that, and keeping it communal and working out internal tensions to move things forward in whatever you want to accomplish. That is what needs to happen. And I think we were miseducated, as Hari Han likes to say, into thinking, oh, if we can go viral, that's that's power, or even on a more intimate level, that's community, because that's not community either. You know, the people that are liking your tweets are not necessarily the people that are bringing you soup when you're sick. And that's something Bob likes to point out. Real relationships that are sustained over the long run through tension and vulnerability are the things that make us feel whole. And then they're also the things that give us the power to achieve what we want to achieve together. So I think we got to fight off that distraction and keep remembering it's about the connections in the real world. That's one part of it. I'll throw it to my sister if you have others you want to share.
Yeah. And, you know, and I think another thing we loved, and just, I think, you know, going back as, you know, former journalists working on this too, and being able to kind of look back with some criticism on, you know, what this like over attention in national media has given is, you know, a lot of people watch the news every night and then they turn it off and they feel hopeless. Like, I can't do anything about that thing because it's just so much information that's happening over there. You know, when it was a story about what's happening in your community, you could then go sign up to volunteer, drive down the street, donate some clothes or food if there was a problem. But I think one thing we love about Bob's message that we're trying to bring up in this film is that these ordinary civic organizations have real, you know, power to make change, and they have real importance in our democracy being strong or not strong. So going to that book club, you know, we hope that people coming out of the film are leaving with a new sense of, you know, pride and importance in that action. Or if they're not a member of something, knowing that starting something, even if it's small, like a walking club, there are very big implications that come from that work, and that, you know, people can hear this message of this crisis we're seeing in our democracy and in our community, but then come away feeling not just like, I feel helpless, but there is something I can do. And we hope, you know, the 6 community groups that we highlight are kind of examples of shining light of people doing that in their community. But, you know, it takes work. And as we talked about earlier in this, it takes, you know, practice, you know, working those muscles again. But yeah.
Absolutely. You know, I also, there's another branch of me that's also quite interested in the question of disability justice. Having been not just working in working class Hawaiian community, but also I think back to when I was a young person and my sister would, she was in the director of our Interact Club in high school, I think. For those who don't know, Interact Club is kind of like the high school version of Rotary. And so we worked a lot with our Special Olympics community here in Hawaii. And it was such a great way for us as students to get to know a part of our community that we really didn't know much about. And now as an American Studies scholar, as an anthropologist, I oftentimes think about disability spaces in museums, because the messaging of museum accessibility is about making them accessible to all. And I think that message, even in civic organizing, rings true as well, because I think part of the challenge is making our civic spaces accessible, not making them too complicated. Like Pete, you mentioned sign-up sheets, but as we know, there's like 5 million different sign-up services people use nowadays, and sometimes people actually don't know how to use those services. So I always find it important to also mention that even in civic organizing, it's not always about using the most up-to-date technologies, but really trying to listen to your community and to observe, you know, what are the best ways to reach them without turning them off because of these technological or accessibility barriers.
Yeah. Can I say 2 things on that? First off, I love the point about simple tools. You know, one of the things Jane McAlevey, the union organizer we interviewed in the film, does is she gets a giant piece of paper and she calls them giant wall charts. And all they are is a piece of paper where you like write the names down of all the people that you're trying to organize. And she says, you don't need to go more complicated than this. You know, literally, I force all my organizers, just get the giant piece of paper and a marker. Don't use the latest software. No, and, you know, it's important to not be a Luddite. You know, you want to use software if it's good, but just because it's software or the latest tech does not mean it's good. And we actually have ran into a lot of people during our tour of this film that have said a simple text chain with all the people in the club on it has been my best organizing tool or something like that. One of them even was like, I just have 70 people on a text chain and I just text them all when the next meeting's coming. And, you know, that might be annoying for some people, but it works for them. So, you know, you got to use sometimes the simplest tool is better. On disability rights, one of the funny things about making a movie about civics is you just notice it everywhere. And one of the points we want to make with the movie is that behind every inspiring movement in American history is usually a bunch of clubs lingering in the background, or civic organizing lingering in the background. And, that recent documentary about Judy Heumann that the Obamas put out a few years ago. Crip Camp, yes. And what's so interesting about it is it starts with a summer camp. And it starts with a social network being built at a summer camp, having fun together. It was not an activist summer camp. It was not a come to the summer camp if you want to fight for disability rights. It was come here because you share in an experience and you just go fall in love with each other and become friends and hang out and like have a camp experience. And out of that latent community came an activist group. Also in the history of the ADA is the American Legion, and veterans organizing, because so many injured veterans came out and tried, join the coalition. And, they're not, that's another story of having a latently organized group that didn't get together. The American Legion or the Veterans of Foreign Wars did not get together to do disability rights, but because they were there and organized, suddenly when there was something that mattered to their constituency, they were there to join a national coalition that garnered a lot of sympathy for the cause. So that's just two examples from one movement of how in the background of everything is a club lingering in the way, which is, the whole point of this movie.
Yeah. One of the gems actually of archival we found is, Bob has this data about bowling, at its peak, just thousands and thousands, millions of Americans were members of bowling leagues. And, because so many people were doing it, we actually, it appears on screen just for 3 seconds, but we found a wheelchair bowling league footage from the 50s where, there were a bunch of people that got together, presumably maybe some, who'd been injured in past wars, others probably not, but, this at this high peak of civic life, it's helping everyone across every group, when people are getting together more.
Absolutely. And Pete, I love that you brought up Crip Camp, because I remember watching that documentary, and it was such a great example, like this film, of how a documentary can really get us paying attention to certain issues or stories that for so long nobody really knew about unless you were part of that community, and hopefully providing tools or inspiration for maybe future camps that folks can organize. So really glad that you brought that up and we were able to talk about this. Pete, Rebecca, and Pete, thanks so much for this conversation. The film was fantastic to watch, and kind of in conclusion of our conversation, I wanted to give the floor to you both to see if there was any last remarks or comments that you'd like to make as we end our discussion today.
One thing we like saying, and it's just really at the heart of why we did this, is that, so many people, and we've talked about this throughout the conversation. This has been such a wonderful conversation. Thank you for these really thoughtful questions and sparks of ideas. Is that, I think a lot, we're really, we're talking about America in this movie. We're talking about Bob, but we're also talking about you, like you, the viewer, as an individual sitting watching this film. And one thing when we're kind of sitting alone at night after watching some media or scrolling our phone or something, we often feel, oh gosh, it's so dark out in the world today. There is nothing that I can do alone to solve this, so I'm hopeless. And the real deep message of this film is that you're probably right. There is not much that you can do alone to solve this, but there is a hell of a lot that you can do together to address the problems of our time. And so if you're wondering what the first step is, there is a first step, which is, as Priya Parker says, gathering, and turning that gathering into a routine gathering that is a club, about, even before you tackle the biggest problems of our time, just kind of tackle bringing together people who are just interested in some similar thing or sharing in some struggle. And out of that, what you're doing is not a small thing. It is a huge thing. And for those who aren't joiners, we hope this movie is a nudge to be a joiner. And for those who are super joiners, we hope this movie is a pep rally to remind you that what you're doing is really important, buttressing our whole democracy.
Yeah, one of my favorite lines in the film is Jane McAlevey, the great union organizer, who says, "Democracy's a pain in the ass." And so, you know, I think one thing we also wanted to celebrate in the film is, you know, we have a lot of animation in this film, and we have a lot of photos. We wanted to make like an alternative history book for this film with our animation by bringing all these great archival photos of meetings to the forefront. But a lot of these photos are just a bunch of people sitting around at a table. Maybe they're eating coffee or some food that someone brought. But we wanted it to be a film full of a bunch of photos that no one would recognize. Because all of our textbooks in school, you know, have the same famous people's faces over and over again. But we really wanted to celebrate these everyday heroes that are ultimately doing all the work that, you know, we have Hillary Clinton in the film talking about the women's rights movement that led to the moment where she was able to run for president. But behind that was 50 or more years of a bunch of women sitting around a table talking. And, you know, to get us, you know, to have this upswing and get us back to a moment of, you know, high civic engagement and participation, and to turn around these trends of loneliness that we're seeing in our country right now, you know, it's going to be a pain in the ass too, as Jane McAlevey says. You know, it's going to be going to some meetings that are sometimes boring and sitting at tables, but, you know, along the way, you know, as we also hope to show in the archival, you know, there's fun that's had, there's relationships that are built, friendships, there are marriages that happen, there are babies that are born. And, you know, we hope that people come out of this film and, you know what to do, which is join up.
Absolutely. And if there's one last thing that I can add, is that hopefully can be a challenge to our viewers, is to have a conversation with someone about the film and civic organizing after you watch it. I think part of the point of it is to reconnect again with one another and to start having those conversations again. So Pete, Rebecca, thank you so much again. And back to you, Anna.
Aloha, everyone. Thank you so much, Pete, Rebecca, and Halena, for that very, very inspiring conversation. I really appreciate your time today and having this conversation with us. I'm a joiner, so I feel even extra inspired after hearing today's convo. I just want to remind everybody, if you are watching this discussion in advance of the 19th or the 20th, we are screening Join or Die in theaters on the 19th of October and again on the 20th of October. And you can find full information and purchase tickets online at hiff.org. That's HIFF.org. On the Join or Die page on the website, you can also, again, read a wonderful companion essay written by Halena. I highly recommend everyone to check that out. And last but not least, if you enjoyed this discussion and this film, please check out our 2 other programs in Film for Thought this year. We are showing the film Mustache and also a combined double feature of No Maori Allowed and Still We Rise. So you can find out full information again at our website at hiff.org. So definitely check those all out. Another big mahalo to you all for this conversation. Thank you so much to Hawaii Council for the Humanities, and have a wonderful rest of your day. Thank you.
Thanks.
Aloha.
Take care, everyone.